Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome to everyone who's signing in. I see the numbers increasing there, so that's great. Like I said, we are going to get started in just a moment. Okay, so thank you everyone who's joined us today for today's webinar. So today we're going to be talking about vacation rentals and the differences between vacation rentals and residential tenancies. Not just the differences though, but also what you need to know if you're transitioning from a vacation rental to a residential tenancy. So that is our general topic for today. It is going to be very much the basics of being a landlord when it comes to going from vacation rentals to residential tenancies. For those that, this is your first webinar with us, my name is Hunter Boucher. I'm Director of Operations at LandlordBC. And I'm going to bring on another member of our team in just a moment here. Actually, Kimberly, if you want to go ahead and join with your camera. Fantastic. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thanks very much.
So Kimberly is our Director of Member Engagement, and she's going to just talk to you a little bit about Landlord BC.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Hunter. And thank you everybody for taking the time to attend our webinar today. I just want to confirm I'm using a headset. So Hunter, you can hear me okay?
Perfectly fine.
Awesome. So I wanted to hop on today and just do a little quick intro about Landlord BC and what we do. And the reason I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to touch base with some of the attendees here is that we do know that there are owners of properties out there, especially in some of the hot vacation markets like Kelowna and up that way, the Shuswap, all those really nice little vacation spots, who were putting their rental housing into Airbnb. So they had their investment properties and they were using them as vacation rentals. And that's fine. But with the, this year and COVID and what we're dealing with people not vacationing, a lot of these owners have decided that it's going to be more beneficial for them to put those rentals into the long-term residential market. And that's fantastic. That's what we like to see as an organization, because we are housing advocates. We want to be sure that members of the public, residents of BC, have access to that long-term sustainable rental housing. So for those of you who are entertaining this idea and you're here to learn more about it, ask questions. We're here to help you. We really want to help you succeed at setting up this long-term residential rental housing business. And that's what Landlord BC is all about. So we exist to advocate on behalf of landlords, to educate landlords, and to support you in operating your rentals. So Hunter and his team, they're our legislative experts, and they man our legislative helpline. Hunter also focuses on our education that we offer as an association. And in addition to those great resources, we have proprietary tenancy forums. We have group discount programs, including a fantastic pooled insurance program that every member with Landlord BC should be on, or at least explore, because we get excellent feedback from our members who are enrolled in that program that it does help save them money on their property insurance rates. We have discounts on credit checks to help you with your tenants. Help you with your tenant screening. And then we're constantly working to communicate with you, whether it's via our e-news, our very active social media channels, making sure that you're up to speed on what's going on in the industry. So we know that we're dealing with an unprecedented time. We've been dealing with legislative changes and states of emergency that have been coming fast and furious. It's been a really nonstop roller coaster ride for us here at Landlord BC, and we're here working diligently to be sure that you're all kept up to speed on that. So throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, be sure to ask them to Hunter. If you think of anything after the webinar, you're more than welcome to send an email to our team. My contact information is on the screen there. And if there's any questions about membership, how membership works, how to get enrolled, please feel free to send me an email or reach out to me. We're all working remotely still, but I've got my cell phone right beside me, and I'm available for you 8 to 4:30 to answer any questions you have and help you get started with membership if that's something you're interested in. So other than that, I'll let Hunter get back to the great webinar, and I'm just gonna sit back here, turn my video off, and watch everything happen. So thanks very much, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kimberly. So let's just, there we go. So what's the difference? This is what we're here to talk about today is the difference between vacation rentals and residential. And so the core difference is that in a vacation rental, you are renting your space out to someone for the purposes of travel. They generally are someone who doesn't live in your community, though sometimes people do definitely like to take vacation within the city they live in. But generally, it's someone who is using it as a temporary accommodation for travel. And I mean, it's pretty obvious in most cases. That's things like hotels, Airbnb. There are other things that might apply under that as well. So we're going to get into that in a moment. But it's important to know the difference. We need to know why we're even having this conversation. Why is it important to know the difference? Well, the main reason it's important to know the difference is that there is a piece of legislation that very strictly governs that latter type of tenancy, the Residential Tenancy Act. So for residential tenancies, there's a piece of legislation that covers that. If you don't have a residential tenancy, and we're talking about vacation rentals, at most you probably have the Innkeepers Act, which applies. And if you've ever looked at the Innkeepers Act, it's fairly short, pretty straightforward, doesn't cover a lot. But if you look at the Residential Tenancy Act, in comparison, it's quite a long piece of legislation, very detailed, quite a few rules. And further to the piece of legislation, there's regulations, policy guidelines, rules of procedures, guidance documents, you name it. There's a lot that is covered and regulated and has policies for when you have a residential tenancy versus a vacation rental, which, while the Innkeepers Act might not be the only thing that covers it, there is less to contend with. And a lot of those things that you need to be aware of are somewhat provided to you through the user interfaces such as Airbnb, for example. It's set up to allow you to run that business in a fairly straightforward way, whereas residential tenancies, not as much. There isn't that general tool, aside from, of course, Landlord BC, as Kimberly mentioned. We're here to help you, but you have to know about us first, which you've already made the right decision of joining us on this webinar. You're learning about those differences and learning about the industry that you may be considering joining. So I have up on the screen right now the section of the Residential Tenancy Act that says what the Act applies to. And as you can see, it's pretty unclear. To be quite frank, it says, despite any other enactment, but subject to Section 4, what this Act does not apply to, the Act applies to tenancy agreements, rental units, and other residential property. That's great. I'm sure that most people can read that and say, oh yeah, I get that. I know what it applies to now. Not. It's easier to look at it the other way. If you rent out a space that someone lives in for any period of time, it's easier to then look at when the Act does not apply in that situation, as opposed to try to figure out if every situation does apply. So they actually have that list in the Residential Tenancy Act, Section 4. It lists what the Act does not apply to. Now, I did not include every single thing that the Act does not apply to in this list. If I had done that, it wouldn't have fit on the slide in font that you'd be able to read. There's quite a few things that it does not apply to, but the two that are really important to the average homeowner out there is these two sections, Section C and Section E. When we look at these two sections, the first one says, the Act does not apply to living accommodation in which the tenant shares bathroom or kitchen facilities with the owner of that accommodation. So we need to interpret that a little bit. We need to make sure we can apply that to actual real world scenarios. So if you are a homeowner and you rent out a bedroom in your home, and the person who's renting it from you shares a bathroom or kitchen with you, that situation does not fall under the Residential Tenancy Act. So as it states, and it's pretty straightforward in this case, living accommodation in which the tenant shares bathroom or kitchen facilities with the owner of that accommodation. The next section that is definitely very applicable in this for this webinar in general is it does not count if it is rented out as living accommodation occupied for vacation or travel. So if it's occupied as vacation or travel accommodation, it does not fall under the Residential Tenancy Act. Now, there's no strict definition as to what vacation or travel means, but in general, if it's less than a month and it's intended to be lived in for less than a month, that is generally not going to fall under vacation or travel accommodation. Now, that isn't a hard rule. There are sometimes situations where you could have vacation travel for longer than 1 month, but it is, like as I said, it's going to be different in every situation, but the general rules to look at, if it's less than a month and it was intended to be lived in for less than a month, and you intended it to be lived in as vacation or travel accommodation, that is generally always going to not fall under the Act. Now, intention is definitely important, but it isn't the only thing. If, for example, you have a property that you generally intend to rent out as vacation rental, and you have someone that lives there for, say, 6 months, a year, perhaps even longer, after a while, that vacation accommodation might no longer qualify and the Act might start to apply. And we see this happening from time to time in situations where a hotel over time has transitioned into perhaps weekly rentals and then perhaps monthly rentals, and all of a sudden they have found themselves under the jurisdiction of the Residential Tenancy Act. If you're entirely unsure as to whether or not your situation falls under the Residential Tenancy Act, you can obviously contact us here at Landlord BC. Before you become a member, we will discuss that with you to help you try to decide that and determine which piece of legislation has jurisdiction over your business, because it is a business either way. And if it is too complicated, sometimes we may end up needing to talk to a lawyer or possibly the Residential Tenancy Branch through the process of a dispute resolution hearing where they can determine whether or not they have jurisdiction. It's pretty unlikely you'd get to that point, but it is something to be aware of. So we now kind of have a general understanding of what the Act applies to. It applies to a living accommodation that you rent to someone and it's meant to be their home. And it's not just for travel or vacation. So that's great. We know this piece of legislation applies, but there is more. So when we talk about this industry and running this business, we generally talk primarily about the Residential Tenancy Act. And that's for good reason. It's the primary piece of legislation that affects your rental housing business. But there are other pieces of legislation that affect this business. The Personal Information Protection Act, local bylaws, the Human Rights Code, strata bylaws, the Income Tax Act, and as I mentioned already, of course, the Residential Tenancy Act. And this is just to name a few. There are other pieces of legislation that apply that affect this business as well. It's actually a very nuanced industry with quite a bit of regulation around it. Some of it's quite significant, like the Residential Tenancy Act and the Human Rights Code and the Personal Information Protection Act. Those three pieces of legislation are the primary pieces of legislation that will affect you. Strata bylaws also can have a significant impact if your unit is in a strata building. So again, there's a lot that can affect the running of your business. And it's important to understand how that differs from a vacation rental. Again, in a vacation rental, some of these pieces of legislation certainly apply. The Human Rights Code applies as well. So does the Personal Information Protection Act. Your strata bylaws are going to apply as well, but they're going to apply in different ways. Same with your Income Tax Act. Again, it's going to apply in different ways. So you need to learn the differences. Today, we're going to focus on the differences found mostly in the Residential Tenancy Act. So where do we start? Well, being a landlord generally starts with doing some research, like you're doing right now, which is great, finding out how you're going to run your business, and then placing in an advertisement, finding a tenant, going through a tenant selection process. So this is the first key difference between vacation rentals and residential tenancies. And I say key difference because this is the first real world application where we can see something that is very different from a vacation rental. In most vacation rentals, you have some type of listing service such as Airbnb, there's VRBO, there's countless listings out there. And those generally include a certain selection process. It's fairly limited in most cases. Certainly, you as an owner can set up your own selection process for your vacation rental, but most people just have it as a first come first served basis. You make your listing and you make a reservation and that's it. Tenant selection for residential tenancies is very different. It's a much more involved process. And that's a good thing. You want to be involved in this process. It requires some work from you and at the beginning, but you want to make sure that you are selecting the best possible tenant, the best fit for your residential property, for you, for their neighbors. So you're going to generally always start with placing an advertisement, moving on to receiving responses, do some interviewing with them, so talk to them phone or email. You'll likely show the unit to respective applicants. You should have an application form. And this is really important. Having an application form is actually probably one of the most important parts of your tenant selection process. Having one place where you gather a fairly significant amount of information that you can keep secure. And I say you keep it secure because the Personal Information Protection Act says you must keep it secure. And it's obviously a prudent business choice nonetheless, even if it didn't say that, but you need to keep that secure. You also want to make sure that you have a trusted application form, one that complies with things like the Personal Information Protection Act, which the one provided by Landlord BC does. Once you get an application form filled out, you want to probably verify some of that information, check references, and perhaps, again, another key difference, perhaps run credit checks. So a credit check is something that can be done in the tenant selection process when you have a residential tenancy. At the very end of that, you probably confirm some information and then select your tenant. So as we can see from this very brief and not overly in-depth look at tenant selection, that is quite a bit more comprehensive and involved than you would go through for your standard vacation rental. And the reason that you want to do that is in a vacation rental, well, you know that the person is probably going to only be there for maybe a weekend, maybe a week, maybe a month, possibly. But it's unlikely they're going to be staying longer. So the amount of work you put in to that selection process is kind of comparable to the type of time that the person is staying, the type of commitment. But in a residential tenancy, the commitment is for quite a bit longer. And we're going to get into that in a moment, but it's obviously generally always going to be more than a month, probably a year at the minimum. And that's kind of average tenancy length. So if we're looking at that, you obviously want to make sure that that person is the right fit. They're not just going to leave at the end of their booking. So When it comes to developing your tenant selection process, members of Landlord BC we have a workshop in our webinar archive that talks all about this. So there are resources to look into this in a much more in-depth fashion. Like I said, this is just a very brief overview of that. We then move on to the next part of a tenancy, which is the tenancy agreement. Again, something that's very different from vacation rentals. In BC, landlords must have a standard agreement. Now, specifically, you must have standard wording in your agreement. And we have a form that's available to our members that has that standard wording. And the standard wording sets out very basic rules and rights and responsibilities for both the landlord and the tenant, but it is very, very basic. Our agreement that we provide to our members is quite a bit more comprehensive. It has quite a bit more rules in it and responsibilities, some for the tenant, many for the landlord or for the other party. You may also add rules to the agreement, but when it comes to adding rules to your agreement, they must comply with that piece of legislation, that very important piece of legislation, the Residential Tenancy Act. So, of course, when we talk about vacation rentals, your agreement that you have in place is generally the policy that you set up for things like the use of the rental unit, such as no smoking, which is something that's very similar. You can set a rule in your tenancy agreement that says no smoking or no pets. So again, in residential tenancy, so one of the differences is that tenancy, that agreement must be signed. So you must have that signed, as opposed to when we look at vacation rentals, it's generally just checking a box saying I agree. So looking at tenancy agreements, when you fill out a tenancy agreement, you need to assume, what you should assume is that tenancy agreement, this is again a very big difference between the two types of businesses, is that tenancy agreement is likely going to continue on pretty much forever, possibly. I mean, it's not likely that it will last forever, and the average length of a tenancy is just over a year, so it's not likely that it will, but it could. Most tenancies are what's known as a fixed term tenancy, and at the end of that fixed term, the default by law is that it goes on a month-to-month tenancy. So it transfers from a fixed term tenancy to a month-to-month. Now, month-to-month doesn't mean you just say as a landlord, okay, well, I'm done and you have to leave in a month. There are ways in which you can end a tenancy, and we're going to get to that later on. But at the beginning of the tenancy, you can set up what's known as a fixed term tenancy with a vacate clause. This may only be used in situations where the landlord or the landlord's spouse or a close family member of either intend to reside in the rental unit after the fixed term. So if you want a tenancy that is only going to last for 6 months, you can do that, but the only reason you're allowed to do that, the only reason you can put on that tenancy agreement is that you, your spouse, or a close family member of you or your spouse intend to reside in the rental unit after the fixed term, so after that 6 months or a year. And you can set a fixed term length for pretty much any length of tenancy you want. If you want it for 6 months, that's fine. A year is fine. If you want it for 3 years, that would also be perfectly fine. It's not fairly common to see that, but certainly it is allowed. It's also important to note that close family member is defined, and it's defined specifically as a parent or child of the landlord or the landlord's spouse. So to recap that, when you're setting up a tenancy, you need to assume that tenancy may last really forever. It might just keep on going. The tenant might not move out. They might not do anything that warrants an end of tenancy. You might not have a reason that's valid to end a tenancy. So you need to consider, which is why, of course, you need to consider your tenant selection process, because you might be stuck with this person as your tenant for quite a long time. So moving on to the next kind of part of this of a tenancy, and that is the deposits. Oftentimes you take a deposit at the beginning of the tenancy when you sign your tenancy agreement. And there's two types of deposits you as a landlord under residential tenants, the Residential Tenancy Act, are allowed to take. The first is a security deposit. And a security deposit is something that is up to half a month's rent. It allows you can use that amount for things like lost rent if they don't pay all of their rent 1 month. You can use it for damage to the rental unit, cleaning, unpaid utility bills. The security deposit in general is used to cover anything that is left outstanding at the end of the tenancy. There's a process that you must go through to do that, and we will touch on that at the end of our webinar today. But in short, it's important to note that it's meant to be used for pretty much anything that comes up during the length of the tenancy. And again, it's used at the end of the tenancy. There's also a pet damage deposit. If you as a landlord allow a tenant to keep a pet in the rent unit or the residential property, you may collect a pet damage deposit of up to half of a month's rent. So if you allow them to have a pet and you took a pet damage deposit, you would hold in total 1 month's rent of deposits. That would be half a month's rent for your security deposit and half a month's rent for the pet damage deposit. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about how we deal with those deposits at the end of the tenancy, near the end of our webinar. So we're going to kind of somewhat go through, as you can see, the life of a tenancy throughout this webinar. So the question that then comes up is, well, what about a furniture deposit? You have a vacation rental and you're switching it over to a residential tenancy. So there's a good chance that that rental unit is furnished. And that's perfectly fine. You can have a furnished rental unit in a residential tenancy. It's not an incredibly common thing. Most people who are living in a home that they want as their home will have their own furniture or want to have their own furniture. But certainly furnished units in residential tenancies can happen. And there's a certain niche market that wants that for a variety of reasons. So then the question still is, what about a furniture deposit? Well, when we look at the Residential Tenancy Act and the regulations, the two things where we find information, the two places we find information about deposits, it does not list a furniture deposit as something that you are allowed to take. The only two deposits that you are allowed to take under the Residential Tenancy Act in general are your security deposit and your pet damage deposit. So the furniture deposit would fall under the purview of a security deposit, or perhaps under the pet damage deposit as well, if the furniture is damaged by a pet. So the deposits that you have in place already, those two deposits are the ones that you would generally use. So something that's very much tied to the deposit is a condition inspection. And again, as we can see, this is something that's very different from a vacation rental. Generally with a vacation rental, you might not even meet the person that's staying in your vacation rental. You might just have a lockbox that they get a key to, or a code to get their key to the unit, and that's it. But in residential tenancies, you must conduct a move in and move out condition inspection. And it must be in an approved form. There is a form for that, and we do provide one to our members as well. This isn't a situation where you have to use the exact form that the government provides, but there are certain requirements for the form, which the LandlordBC form does adhere to. So you do this move-in inspection at the start of the tenancy when the unit is vacant. That's a really important part. You do the inspection before the tenant has actually moved in their belongings. There's also rules about the scheduling of condition inspections, and we're going to talk about that more at the end when we talk about the move out inspection, because at move in inspection, the scheduling is pretty straightforward. You're going to communicate with the tenant about when you want to do the inspection before they even move in. And generally, a recommendation is to do the inspection before you've given them the keys to move in. If they're going to move in on the 1st at 10 o'clock in the morning, well, do the inspection on the 1st at 9:30 or 9:45. We go back to furniture. If you do have a furnished unit, then you need to make sure that you're documenting the furniture in your condition inspection report. Now, the standard condition inspection report provided by the RTV and the one provided by Landlord BC do not have a lot of space for furniture on it. And that's on purpose. There's only so much we can put on one form, and most tenancies don't have furniture. So they don't include a lot of space. They just generally have one line for furniture in general. We recommend adding another page where you simply list the items of furniture that you have in the unit and write down the state of each item. So again, make sure you document the furniture that's in that unit, because if you don't document the state of the unit, which includes the furniture, at the beginning of the tenancy, at the end of the tenancy, if there's damage to it, you have waived your right to claim against any of that damage that was done to your rental unit. So again, that's one of the, again, very, very big differences, is that to protect your rights as a landlord under the Residential Tenancy Act, you have to take certain steps to protect them. They're not passive rights. You have to actually do something to protect those rights. And in this case, when it comes to the condition of the rental unit and the furniture, it's documentation. That is how you do this. And you should document it, as mentioned, with your tenant. They're part of the process. And if you use the form, it kind of leads you through the inspection in a logical way. There's spots for the landlord to sign and for the tenant to sign as well. We're going to skip over everything that kind of happens in the middle of the tenancy, because we don't really have time to go through all of the things that could possibly happen during a tenancy. It is suffice to say that a lot can happen during a tenancy, and there's generally rules about how you proceed during that tenancy. Things like how you enter a tenant's unit. Well, you have to give a notice of entry. Rent increases. There's rules about how much notice, how much rent can be increased, and how often it can be increased. Again, we're not going to go through all of the details on that right now, because we only have an hour to go through this, and I want to get to your questions as well. So we are going to jump now to the end of tenancies. We're going to take a bit of time to go through this. And it's important to know how tenancies end, because again, it is a very, very different thing from running a vacation rental. In a vacation rental, it generally ends because their booking has ended. It's not overly likely that someone is overstaying their welcome in your vacation rental, your Airbnb, or however you have it set up. It certainly is possible, but it's much less likely in a vacation rental. So it's important to know how tenancies do in fact come to an end in residential tenancies. This is straight from the Residential Tenancy Act. So it says a tenancy may end if the tenant or landlord gives notice to end tenancy in accordance with the Residential Tenancy Act. The tenancy agreement is a fixed-term tenancy agreement that, in the circumstances prescribed, requires the tenant to vacate the rental unit at the end of the term. So we've already talked about that one. It can also end if the landlord and tenant agree in writing to end the tenancy. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. It can end if the tenant vacates or abandons the rental unit. It can also end if the tenancy agreement is frustrated, or if there's an order from the director. And in the context of the Residential Tenancy Act, when we say the director, we're referring to an arbitrator at the residential tenancy branch. They have a dispute resolution process that allows landlords and tenants to resolve disputes, as the title suggests. And the individuals who preside over those hearings are arbitrators, and they are, through the director of the Residential Tenancy branch, they have the authority to make decisions on the director's part. So whenever it refers to the director, we're generally talking about an arbitrator. Not always, but in this case, we certainly are. Tenancy can also come to an end if the agreement is a sublease agreement. We're not going to get into too much detail on that. So going back to the top, the tenancy may end if the tenant or landlord gives notice to end the tenancy in accordance with the Act. And we're going to focus on those in a few slides. So that means that there are ways in which a landlord and a tenant can end a tenancy by giving notice. There's rules about that type of notice for both parties. And on the part of a landlord, there's specific forms that would need to be used. The second one here, again, another very important one that we've already gone over. You can have a fixed term tenancy with a vacate clause, but it must be because you or your spouse or your close family member of you or your spouse intends to move into the rental unit at the end of that term. And again, another one that we'll go into is the landlord and tenant agree in writing to end a tenancy, a mutual agreement. And the last one that we're going to go over here is the tenant vacates or abandons the rental unit. So going through these, there's the mutual agreement to end tenancy. A mutual agreement to end tenancy allows both parties to, as the name suggests, mutually agree to end a tenancy at a specific date. And it can be a really great tool for ensuring that the tenancy does come to an end in a timely way, in a way that works for everyone involved. So if you, for example, you have a fixed term tenancy, it's set for a year, and 3 months in, the tenancy is just not working. You're not getting along with them, they're not getting along with you. Perhaps you have cause to end the tenancy, maybe you don't, and we'll get into what cause means in a moment. But both parties agree that this tenancy just needs to come to an end for whatever reason. You can come to an agreement at that time to mutually agree to end the tenancy. And what's really a really good tool, or why it's a good tool, is that it can end at any date that both parties agree. So if you want to agree to end the tenancy tomorrow, for example, you could do that. That would be perfectly fine. So it is certainly a good tool. It can be used in situations where the agreement is clearly mutual, that both parties want to end the tenancy. Moving on to abandonment. This does happen. Tenants occasionally will leave without giving any notice. But you need to look at a variety of factors. And we could probably spend a whole, well, in fact, I know we can spend a whole webinar on just abandonment in general, because we have done that in the past. Today, we're just going to look at the very basics of it. If a tenant were to leave the rental unit, to consider it abandoned, we need to look at when did the tenant last regularly reside in the unit? How long have they left the unit for? Have they removed all or most of their belongings? Have they indicated that they're not returning to the rental unit? Or are there circumstances surrounding the departure such that it would be unlikely for them to return? So an example of abandonment that very much fits the kind of modern era that we're in right now, specifically the COVID era, would be that they have left the country because they need to go back to their home country to quarantine themselves or be with their family. And we've certainly seen a number of these situations come up over the past few months, where the tenant is originally from another country. They've decided to go back home or to their other home in their home country. And so the circumstances around that, if they've communicated that they're not returning, they've left the country, they've perhaps they remove their belongings. That might be an abandoned property situation. And there's rules and regulations, specifically regulations that govern this. And like I said, this is a very brief look at this. We could spend an hour just on this topic alone. So moving on to tenant's notice. A notice to end tenancy from a tenant must include their name, the rental unit address, a statement that ends the tenancy, the date of the end of tenancy, and their signature. Now, the statement ending tenancy, you won't find that specifically in the Residential Tenancy Act, but what that means is it needs to say something on that notice that ends the tenancy. They have to actually say that they are wanting to end their tenancy. If they just give you everything else on a piece of paper, it doesn't really count. So there has to be something indicating that it needs to end the tenancy. It obviously needs to have their name, their rental unit address, their date of end of tenancy, and a signature. So pretty straightforward. There's no set form that they must use necessarily, but it does need to include these basic things. So then go on to landlord's notice. So you, as a landlord, can end the tenancy and tenancy. And we kind of talked about one way, which is to have a fixed term with a vacate clause. We're going to talk now about the direct notices that you can give. And we're not going to go into great detail about each one of these. And truthfully, hopefully you'll never actually end up at this point where you need to do this. One of the things that we really focus on at Landlord BC is that you should be able to generally communicate with your tenant in a way that ensures that you don't get to the point. And truthfully, most tenancies don't get to a point where you need to serve a notice to end tenancy. Most tenancies come to an end just because the tenant needs to move on for totally normal and valid and positive reasons. That perhaps their family is growing, they want to live a little closer to work, they're moving to another city. These are all normal reasons and the most common reasons that tenancies end. It's very rare, really, and when you look at the number of tenancies that are active in this province, over half the population of this province rent, well, that's a significant number of people renting, and most of them end positively for very, very normal reasons. But it is also important to know how you as a landlord may end a tenancy in certain situations, and how perhaps you can't end a tenancy. Because knowing what your rights and your responsibilities are on this is really important before you get into this business. You don't want to enter this business thinking that you can end the tenancy for any reason whatsoever, and then find out down the road that you can't. So when we look at these notices, there's 4 notices that we're going to look at. One is the 10-day notice to end tenancy for unpaid rent or utilities, RTB 30. All the forms, of course, have numbers on the Residential Tenancy Act, so you can match it up to make sure it's the right form, but the titles are also pretty explanatory. There's the 1-month notice to end tenancy, 2-month notice to end tenancy, and the 4-month notice to end tenancy. Now, the 10-day notice to end tenancy is really quite straightforward. This is used in situations where the tenant has not paid their rent or utilities, and rent is generally due on the 1st of the month. If they don't pay on the 1st of the month, on the 2nd, you can issue a 10-day notice. We recommend, as mentioned already, communicate with your tenants, try to discuss with them about whether or not they are able to pay. Maybe they just forgot. All sorts of reasons can pop up as to why tenants don't pay their rent. So have a conversation before you give the notice to end tenancy. But you can end a tenancy using a 10-day notice to end tenancy for unpaid rent. The next notice is the 1-month notice. This is used generally when there's a problem in the tenancy. For the purposes of our webinar today, that's what we'll focus on. If you have an issue that has arisen in the tenancy, so your agreement, for example, says no pets, and they've moved in and they have a pet, well, that's something that is a material term of that tenancy. And you would be able to end that tenancy using a 1-month notice. And there's a process to go through. And again, we have a full-length webinar just on that topic alone. But it's important to know that there is a solution to end those tenancies if it does get to that point. So hopefully it won't, and you can communicate your way through that without having to get to an end of tenancy. We then look at the 2-month notice to end tenancy. This is used generally when the landlord, landlord's spouse, or their close family member is going to move into the unit. And I know you're probably thinking, well, what about the fixed term? Well, the fixed term is obviously the preferable way of doing that. But what happens if your tenant has lived there for 2-3 years? You didn't sign the agreement thinking you were going to move in, but now plans have changed. You do want to live in the unit, or your son wants to move in, your daughter wants to move into the unit. Those are valid reasons to use the 2-month notice. And there's rules about using the 2-month notice that are really important to be aware of. Things like the fact that if you're going to live in the unit, you should live there for at least 6 months. If you serve the 2-month notice and you don't do the thing that you said you were going to do, so you said you were going to move in, and then you don't move in, and instead you re-rent the unit, whether to another tenant or through a vacation rental, that would be a misuse of that form. And because you serve that in bad faith, there is a penalty for serving that notice in bad faith, and that penalty is 12 months rent. So as you can tell, that is a very significant thing. That is a large amount of rent, a large amount of compensation to have to pay the tenant. The next notice is the 4-month notice to end tenancy. Very similar to the 2-month notice. In fact, it used to be a 2-month notice, and they've split some of the reasons to use the forms and created a new one for the 4-month notice. When we look at the 4-month notice, it's generally used in situations where the landlord is doing repairs or renovations. And significant repairs or renovations, so significant that the tenant cannot live in the rental unit for an extended period of time. And again, when we say cannot live in it, it's not just that it would be a minor inconvenience for a couple of weeks, it's that they cannot live in it. There's no possible way for them to live in the unit for an extended period of time. This is generally used in situations where you're doing work that affects the electrical system, for example, the plumbing, for, again, an extended period of time. It's not just replacing a toilet or a sink. It's redoing the plumbing system in general. It's seismic upgrades is a good example. Or dealing with asbestos. As soon as you have to deal with asbestos, well, generally tenants can't live in the unit while you're dealing with that, and it might be for an extended period of time. So those are the types of situations where you might use a 4-month notice for repairs and renovations. It also gets used in situations where where you're demolishing the rental unit. And again, there's rules about the use of this, when to use it, compensation that's given to the tenant, and rules about giving it in bad faith, very similar to the 2-month notice. If it's served in bad faith, so served and then you don't do that thing you said you were going to do, such as demolish the building, but instead you rent it out to someone else, the compensation, the additional compensation that gets awarded to the tenant is 12 months rent as well. So quite significant. So moving on to the last part of our webinar today, we're going to talk about end of tenancy procedures. You must conduct a move-out inspection at the end of the tenancy, and there are specific ways in which a deposit is handled at the end of the tenancy. So when we look at that, the condition inspection report, it must be scheduled in accordance with the Residential Tenancy Act and regulations. When it comes to scheduling that generally means offering 2 opportunities and potentially serving a government form. There is a form to schedule a condition inspection. It's something that might be used at the beginning of the tenancy as well, though not overly common then. But at the end of the tenancy, it can be quite useful. It must be in the approved form, so there's a form that you can use for that we provide, as well as the residential tenancy branch. And again, much like the beginning, the unit must be empty. So when it comes to dealing with deposits, At the end of the tenancy, if the tenant were to provide you with a forwarding address, which under the Residential Tenancy Act, a tenant is supposed to supply you with a forwarding address in writing, you must, within 15 days of the later of the date the tenancy ends or the date the forwarding address was provided, either return the deposit, apply to retain the deposit, or obtain a signed written consent to retain all or part of the deposit. And that applies to both the security deposit and the pet damage deposit. Again, we have full webinars just on the end of tenancy procedures in general, so we're not going to get into much more detail on that. But again, it's really important to note that there is a time frame. So you have a limited amount of time to deal with this. And if you do not deal with it properly in that time frame, there's a penalty for that. And the penalty is that the tenant will be able to apply to get their deposit back in double. So they'd be able to get double the deposit returned if you do not handle it properly. Truthfully, handling the deposit properly at the end of the tenancy, for the most part, is fairly straightforward. It's, as mentioned, return the whole thing or apply through the residential tenancy branch. They have a dispute resolution process to retain the deposit, or obtained signed written consent to retain all or part of the deposit. And we find that this is a situation that new landlords often end up having a problem with because you simply might not have been aware of this process. But not being aware of it doesn't remove the obligation that you have to follow this process. So certainly make sure that you, at the end of the tenancy, if you are coming to near to one, that you understand what your process is before getting too far into it. And lastly, a brief note on the pet damage deposit. As I mentioned at the beginning, the security deposit is used generally to cover pretty much anything that is owed by the tenant. So at the end of the tenancy, if they have unpaid rent, unpaid utilities, damage to the unit, cleaning costs, strata fines, those are things that definitely can pop up. If they have any of those types of costs, the security deposit can be used for that. The pet deposit generally can only be used to cover pet damage unless at the end of the tenancy they agree otherwise. So another way of looking at that is that if the tenant doesn't agree to you keeping the pet damage deposit to cover something other than pet damage at the end of the tenancy, you cannot apply through the residential tenancy branch, through the dispute resolution process, to retain that deposit. So again, that's something that's very important to be aware of, is that it cannot be used. An arbitrator cannot award the pet damage deposit for something like, say, unpaid rent. So that finishes our presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a brief overview. There's quite a bit of information that we went through today, and each one of those topics could be its own full-length webinar. So, if you are not a member of LandlordBC, I do recommend that you go to our website, landlordbc.ca. If you're not already receiving our newsletter, sign up for our newsletter. Non-members can get access to that as well, and it provides a bit of information. Though I will have to say that the newsletter that goes to our members is a bit more comprehensive. But certainly sign up for our newsletter, and if you sign up for membership, you also get access to things like the webinar archive. So I'm going to go ahead and take some questions now. You'll notice that there is a question and answer tool in the Zoom toolbox there. So if you want to go ahead and put your questions in, we'll try to get through so as many of those questions as possible. So good question here is, at what point in the rental process are you able to request the security deposit? And the answer to that is pretty straightforward. At the beginning of the tenancy, so when you actually enter into an agreement with someone, that is when you would generally request it. We don't generally recommend asking for one before then, because you want to make sure that you're requesting deposits only from people that you actually are entering into tenancy agreements with. So when you sign the agreement, that's part of that process. And oftentimes what will happen is you'll say, okay, we're going to meet to sign the agreement. And obviously during this time right now, during COVID-19, we're perhaps not meeting in person. We might be doing this via email, but you might say, okay, I'm going to send you the tenancy agreement. Can you sign it and also send me the security deposit, which might be, an email money transfer, for example, which is a perfectly valid way of taking the deposit. And the other important part on deposits is that from the date that you request them, tenants have 30 days to actually make that payment. So another question that's come up is, how much of a deposit can you ask for with a rental application? And the answer to that is none. You don't take a deposit at the time of application because you haven't actually accepted the person as a tenant at that point. You only take a deposit at the time where you actually accept someone as your tenant. So again, that is done just at the time of signing the agreement generally. There's no application deposit or a holding fee or a deposit because someone's interested in the unit. You only take the deposit once you've actually agreed to enter into a tenancy with someone. The question here is, what will the rent increase for 2021 be? And the answer is we don't know yet. And the reason that we say we don't know yet is because the rent increase generally comes out at the end of August, beginning of September. There's a formula that to calculate it and such, and all of the information isn't generally made available until mid to late August. So the government releases that a little later. So for the question here is, for snowbirds who might only be coming for a fixed 6-month term, can you mutually agree to the fixed term, or they would have rights to stay longer? So the answer here is, if you have tenants who are wanting to come here just for 6 months, you can have a fixed term tenancy, but you can only sign a fixed term with a vacate clause if you or your close family member intend to move in to the unit at the end of that term. The next part of this is, could you mutually agree to the fixed term? And again, the only time you can use that fixed term tenancy with a vacate clause is if you, your spouse, or your close family member intend to move into the unit. What you really need to be aware of is that if you're signing a residential tenancy, you need to assume that there's a good chance that this tenancy will last longer than the initial term. So you might have an initial term of 6 months or a year, and both people are agreeing that this is the minimum length the tenancy will be. It's not a maximum length. The tenancy may continue longer, and the natural default to any tenancy after a fixed term is that it will be month to month. And just another question that's on the same topic: if a tenancy lapses, so you have a fixed term that lapses and is not renewed, does the tenancy agreement change to month? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, if you have a fixed term tenancy, not one with a vacate clause because you're moving in, but you have a fixed term tenancy, again, as mentioned, the natural default is that it would just revert or become a month-to-month tenancy. So as soon as that we get into that next month, it's month to month on the same terms though that were originally put in that tenancy agreement. So that the end of the fixed term doesn't mean the end of rights and responsibilities under that agreement. It just means that that obligation during that time frame is no longer there. So the next question here is, what happens if the tenant does not pay the deposit within 30 days of the request, the ask for the deposit? So when you ask for the deposit, they have 30 days to pay. If they don't pay in that 30 days, then you as a landlord would have the option of giving a 1-month notice to end tenancy. We're just going to do one last question here. So the question here is regarding the world we're living in right now around COVID-19. Can landlords send a 10-day notice to end tenancy for non-payment of rent for rent that was unpaid during the state of emergency, so the last several months? And what does that process look like? And the answer to that is, right now, no. The government has announced a plan, and we'll likely have more details shortly, to put in a repayment plan, have in place for landlords. They have to, there's a process you'll need to go through to put in place repayment plans with those tenants who have not paid rent during the state of emergency. The full process in terms of what it looks like, we provided some information to our members. And again, we're going to provide more information in the coming days to weeks as more information becomes available to us. If you're not already getting our newsletters, you're not a member of LandlordBC, then go to the LandlordBC website and sign up for the newsletter there to get the most up-to-date information on the changing environment around this exact process, because again, it is something that is changing. So thank you again to everyone who has attended this webinar. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you. Have a good day.